Welcome to Hardly, where each book is distilled into a chronological story, offering you a special journey in just minutes. Today, we study together Stephen Westaby's The Knife's Edge, the heart and mind of a cardiac surgeon, in which we probe into the immense psychological and emotional toll that balancing life and death in surgery imposes on a person's mind and soul, and how this shapes not only their career, but also their personal life. Stephen Westaby is a heart surgery specialist and artificial heart specialist with a PhD in bioengineering. Don't go away. Hurdley, the editor, will be right back with the story. Stephen grew up in the industrial town of Scunthorpe, a place where steel was the lifeblood of the community, and where young boys were expected to follow in the footsteps of their fathers, working in factories. But Stephen had other plans, even if they seemed wildly out of reach for a boy from the back streets. His father worked long hours, and Stephen often saw the toll it took on him, pushing him to think beyond the factory life. Determined to escape this world, he threw himself into his studies. It was the 1970s, and the idea of becoming a heart surgeon was as grand as becoming an astronaut. Back then, heart surgery was still considered a last frontier. He knew that entering medical school was the first, but not the last, of many daunting challenges. There was the intense competition, but also a personal battle, overcoming self-doubt and financial barriers. As he navigated medical school, Stephen witnessed something few would dare to face: the thin line between life and death. Early on in his surgical training, one of his first real brushes with mortality came during a simple operation. In those days, mistakes were unforgiving, and Stephen quickly learned that failure often had a body count. "I was more the surgeon than the literary genius," he reflects, underscoring the ruthless nature of the profession that demanded perfection. Despite being from a small town, his ambition was anything but small. In the late 1970s, Stephen entered the world of heart surgery, a field reserved for the most daring and skilled. Back then, the heart-lung machine was still a relatively new invention, and surgery was as much an art as it was science. He recalls the nerve-wracking feeling of holding a human heart for the first time, knowing that even a single wrong move could cost someone their life. It was an environment fueled by adrenaline, where every decision was a gamble. The young surgeon was also shaped by the pioneers around him, flamboyant, bold, and immune to fear. These were men who took on cases others wouldn't dare touch, and Stephen learned to embrace that mentality. Yet the price of this constant pressure began to show itself. The psychological weight was heavy, but necessary. "You need the courage to fail," Stephen admits, a sentiment that would follow him throughout his career. As he moved further into the heart of surgery, the challenges mounted. It wasn't just about skill, it was about endurance. The pressure to perform under impossible circumstances tested his resilience, but it also forged the foundations of the surgeon he was becoming, someone who thrived on risk but was increasingly aware of its costs. The stage was set for even more complex and dangerous operations, leading into the next chapter of his life, where failure was not just a possibility, but a constant companion. From the adrenaline-fueled operations to the emotional highs and lows, Stephen's life was about to enter a phase where the stakes would climb even higher. Next, we follow Stephen as he steps fully into this world where every cut carries the weight of life and death. Stephen's career was now in full swing, and the operating room had become his battleground. It was the 1980s, and heart surgery was advancing rapidly, but it was still far from routine. Each surgery felt like a step into the unknown, where success meant a new lease on life for the patient, and failure meant death, sometimes within minutes. This was where Stephen thrived, though the tension never left him. Every day, he had to face the reality that one mistake could undo years of training and skill. It was not for the faint of heart, and Stephen wasn't faint of heart. One day, he was confronted with a particularly desperate case: a young child no older than 5, suffering from a severe heart defect. The child had been turned away by several other surgeons, deemed too risky to operate on. The parents arrived, exhausted and desperate, clinging to the hope that Stephen would be willing to do what others wouldn't. Without hesitation, Stephen took on the case, fully aware of the risks. He knew that every second counted once the heart-lung machine was turned on. In those moments, it wasn't just about skill, it was about making the right decision when everything was falling apart. The operation was going well at first, but then complications hit. Blood began to pool in unexpected places, and the tiny heart seemed to resist every attempt at repair. Some evolve into an extraordinary battle for survival, and a few are quite literally a bloody disaster, he recalled. The team worked frantically, and Stephen's hands moved with the precision of someone who had been through this countless times before. But there was always something different with each case, and no amount of experience could fully prepare him. After hours of delicate work, the heart finally responded. The child survived. It was a victory, but one that came at a cost, physically, mentally, and emotionally. But it wasn't always victories. Stephen also recounts a third-time mitral valve replacement that ended in disaster. The previous surgeries had left the heart adhered to the breastbone, and when the saw hit the bone, the heart tore. Blood gushed everywhere, and Stephen knew the man was beyond saving. That day, he left the operating room and headed straight to the pub. The toll of such losses never left him. I dispatched the registrar to talk to the man's wife while I went off to the pub. The NHS system didn't make these situations any easier, with its bureaucratic hurdles and lack of resources often preventing him from getting the equipment and support he needed. Yet, the adrenaline and the high of saving lives were addictive. He kept taking on cases others avoided, becoming the surgeon people turned to when no one else would. The strain of perfectionism was a constant companion. Every failure haunted him, but he never backed down. The pressure molded him, even as it left him emotionally drained. His relentless drive to push the boundaries of what was possible in heart surgery became both his greatest strength and his heaviest burden. As Stephen neared the twilight of his career, the constant strain began to raise difficult questions. How long could someone live at the edge of life and death before it all became too much? This was the beginning of a deeper reflection, not just on the operations themselves, but on what it all meant. The adrenaline would fade, but the memories and the ghosts of those he couldn't save would linger. Next, we'll explore Stephen's reflections on his career, where he looks back on his personal and professional journey with a mixture of pride, regret, and introspection. By the time Stephen reached the later stages of his career, the adrenaline that once fueled him had worn thin, replaced by a growing weight of reflection. It was 2016, and he had performed thousands of heart surgeries, each one a battle that left its mark. The endless hours in the operating room, the countless lives saved, and the many lost had taken their toll. The surgical triumphs were no longer as intoxicating. They had become burdens to carry. One patient still haunted him, a young mother who died on the table due to a simple equipment failure. Her death was avoidable, but in the bureaucratic mire of the NHS, the necessary technology hadn't been approved. Ultimately, I lost patients whom I knew could be saved with equipment we were denied in the NHS. This wasn't an isolated incident. The frustration of fighting not only against the clock in surgery, but also against a crumbling healthcare system left Stephen disillusioned. He had always spoken out against the inefficiencies of the NHS, and that outspokenness had consequences. He recalls being vehemently outspoken about the system's deficiencies, only to suffer for it professionally. It wasn't just the patients who bore the brunt of this systemic failure. It was the surgeons, too, who had to live with the consequences of avoidable deaths. Looking back, Stephen began to question not just the system but the personal cost of living life on the edge. Surgery had demanded sacrifices he hadn't fully realized until later. His relentless drive and perfectionism had come at the expense of his personal life, particularly his family. He reflects on how his marriage and relationships were strained by the pressures of his career. "So taxing is the lifestyle that by the end of my career, few UK graduates were prepared to make it their calling." The life of a heart surgeon was no longer the prestigious path it had once been, and fewer young doctors were willing to endure what Stephen had. In this final reflection, Stephen isn't just mourning the losses, he's also grappling with his own identity. Surgery had defined him for so long that stepping away left him unsure of who he was without the scalpel in his hand. He wasn't only looking back at his legacy in the operating room, he was also questioning the future of heart surgery. With fewer surgeons stepping up to replace the pioneers, what would happen to the specialty he had dedicated his life to? Would the system ever evolve to match the advancements in medicine? As Stephen left the operating room for the last time, he was filled with a mixture of pride, regret, and uncertainty. The toll was heavy, but the legacy was undeniable. He had pushed the boundaries of what was possible in heart surgery, even if it had come at a personal cost. As we look to the future, Stephen's reflections remind us that progress is often painful, both in medicine and in life. But it's in that pain that we find the strength to question what matters most. A surgeon is driven by a combination of relentless determination, an addiction to the adrenaline of saving lives, and a deep sense of responsibility. The desire to push boundaries and take on cases others won't fuels their commitment, even when failure means death. However, the emotional toll is immense. They cope through detachment, sometimes turning to alcohol or isolation, but the weight of losses often follows them. Personal relationships suffer, and many are left questioning their identity and worth beyond the operating room. As the editor of Hardly, I believe that by examining the cost of perfectionism and systemic failure, we might realize that true progress begins when we stop accepting the status quo and start pushing for meaningful change. The key argument in Stephen's journey is the heavy emotional and psychological toll heart surgery exacts, not just on patients, but on the surgeon as well. His career was a continuous balancing act between life and death, where even the smallest error could end in tragedy. One particularly unforgettable story occurred when Stephen was operating on a young motorcyclist who had been skewered by a fence post in a freak accident. The girl lay there, fully conscious, with the wooden stake penetrating her chest. Despite his years of experience, Stephen knew there was little he could do. Her liver and lungs were shattered and her chances of survival were slim. As he held her hand, the girl whispered, "Can you tell Mom and Dad that I love them, and I'm sorry?" She passed away minutes later, her eyes rolling toward heaven. Stephen couldn't save her, and the weight of that loss stayed with him long after he left the operating room. The story highlights how surgeons, too, carry the emotional scars of their work. It's not just about skill and precision. It's about the lives they couldn't save, the families they faced afterward, and the brutal reality of failure. Ultimately, Stephen's reflections force us to ask, how does someone live with that kind of responsibility every day? And what does it cost them to carry it?